1850, the Civil War was still 10 years away, but sectional conflicts were already heating up over the question of slavery in the new territories acquired from Mexico. Should slavery be permitted in the territories? Could it be banned? Should people in the territories be allowed to decide for themselves? The answers to these questions would determine the future not only of slavery, but of the Union itself. From New York to Charleston, St. Louis to San Francisco, the Oregon Territory to the Territory of New Mexico, the people of the nation would be forced to take sides for or against the South's controversial institution. The area of upstate New York was a hotbed of abolitionism. In Rochester, Frederick Douglass published his abolitionist paper, The North Star. Douglass, Harriet Tubman, John Brown, and other anti-slavery activists guided escaped slaves along underground railroad routes that led through upstate New York to Canada. The American Anti-Slavery Society held meetings in cities and towns across the state, but further south, in New York City, slavery was viewed differently.
When the abolitionist movement breaks out, it's big upstate. All those small farmers, many of them devoutly evangelical, militant folks who want to change the world and cleanse it of sin. New York doesn't want to cleanse anything of sin, because in fact, if they cleanse it, what's going to happen to the cotton flow? And New York City, as a consequence, becomes the most pro-slavery city in the United States. Not because it's slavery itself anymore. By 1827, slavery is illegal in New York State. But because we are totally involved with the Southern well-being, boats carry the stuff up the Mississippi, up the river system, up the new canals. The cotton and the wheat are now pouring out of New York City and going to Europe, and the same boats that are coming back from Europe are bringing with them immigrants. They are bringing manufactured goods. With manufactured goods, the city becomes the great emporium, where slave owners down in Alabama who want, hundreds of shoes for their slaves cheap, they come up now to New York City. They stay in the new hotels that begin to sprout. They, in fact, go to the theater when they're up there for entertainment. The place becomes an amazingly dynamic business center.
Almost 700 miles south in Charleston, South Carolina, a different way of life prevailed. Fearful of the influence of outside forces on its way of life, plantation aristocracy had taken measures earlier in the century to block immigration, limit industrial development, and even prevent railroads from entering the city. But the economic benefits of factories and railroads eventually proved irresistible. By 1850, Charleston was the manufacturing center of South Carolina. Still, it was a city where old traditions died hard.
Charleston by 1850 was the hub of the defense of slavery as the Southern system, and some called Charleston the capital of Southern slavery. It was also a city that was fiercely proud of its appearance, of its beauty. It was called by many the Queen City of the South because of its architectural distinction, its literary traditions, and other cultural aspects of the city that made it a leader in the mid-years of the 19th century.
Charleston may have been the intellectual center of the South, but not all ideas were welcome.
By 1850, white Southerners simply decided that slavery was too fundamental to their society to allow free speech any longer on that issue in the South.
This was a part of this intellectual blockade that also included the Seamen's Acts, which prevented free blacks on ships from being in the city. If they came in on a ship, they had to be jailed during their period in the city. That was a great restraint on trade with various European states as well as with the rest of the country.
Charleston's way of life depended on slavery, but the city also had another side.
There also was a small urban black elite consisting of perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 individuals who had thriving businesses, catering, tailoring, other mechanics trades, especially masonry, were dominated by a urban elite free mulattoes or free blacks who also, to some degree, had slaves working in their operations.
On the boundary between the slave states of the Upper South and the free states of the North lay St. Louis.
Because of its geographical location, on the edge of a border state, a relatively large city in which people could easily get lost, the presence of a large abolitionist population, and the existence of a free state, Illinois, simply across the river, made this a gathering point and departure point for many slaves who were seeking freedom.
Midway between the Great Lakes and the Gulf of Mexico on the Mississippi River, St. Louis was a central point for north-south traffic along the river, as well as for railroad transportation to the east and overland travel to the west. This gateway to the west had a thriving economy, partially based on provisioning trappers, explorers, and pioneers who led the westward expansion.
You have to think by mid-19th century of St. Louis in economic terms as a sort of double fan, with a series of wholesale trading relationships extending all over the east. Simultaneously, St. Louis's impact to the west also looks like a fan in a sense. So you see the trade to Santa Fe and even on down through New Mexico into Mexico, the trade extending up the Missouri River to the Rocky Mountains and beyond.
The acquisition of the New Mexico territory at the end of the Mexican War increased the flow of trade with Santa Fe and promoted the westward expansion that Missourians so desired. From St. Louis, goods, livestock, and humans set out for Independence, Missouri, where they joined up with the Santa Fe Trail.
I think that you would find Santa Fe at 1850 to be growing and bustling. The fort had been built up on the hill, and it was quite a large fort. There was a large flagstaff poking out of it, announcing to the world that this was now the United States. That was 1 year before Doña Gertrudis Barceló, who was the most famous and wealthiest woman of Mexican origin in the territory. That was 1 year before she died. She witnessed Santa Fe at a moment in time when opportunity was present, and she just exploited, I think, those opportunities as much as she could. She ran a gambling hall, a bar, a dance saloon. She also, I think, supplied the town with a social scene, a town that, because it was being overrun in a military takeover, she was able to provide a bit of entertainment, a bit of respite, really, from the war or the battles. As Santa Fe and New Mexico became part of the United States, there needed to be in place people like Latulis who understood the old system and very much wanted the newer system.
The cession of New Mexico to the United States brought new problems for the citizens of Santa Fe and all of the territory, including land rights, a border dispute with Texas, the question of statehood, and of course, slavery. For Indian peoples, it would mean the eventual loss of hunting grounds, water rights, and the freedom to live without U.S. interference.
When the Americans come in, the Pueblos are already settled, they're agriculturalists, they are largely Christian, and so for the United States they don't represent a threat. But the Navajo and the Apache represent a great threat. And we see attacks on wagon trains, attacks on mail trains. We see United States Indian agents and military making forays against the Navajo, the Apaches, and we see the Americans begin to try to use alternating treaty policies and reservation policies to try to get those groups to stay in one place, to become, in a sense, Pueblos.
The Oregon Territory was also populated with numerous Native American tribes. Many encounters between Indians and settlers were friendly, but both sides could turn violent when the threat of danger was perceived. Many settlers in Oregon died at the hands of Indians. Many more Indians died at the hands of settlers.
By the late 1840s, early 50s, the relationship between the white settlers and Native Americans were becoming very strained. Settlers were pushing Indians off of their land. Treaties that were being negotiated were being broken. Indians were dying again from diseases.
Oregon provided unlimited fertile land for pioneers who were willing to make the difficult overland crossing on the Oregon Trail. Its abundance of natural resources made it attractive to farmers, and its abundance of Indian peoples made it attractive to missionaries.
There was a religious fervor that was running through the United States, and that inspired a number of churches to send missionaries out to the West to convert Native Americans to various denominations.
By 1842, Oregon was sufficiently populated by settlers to form a territorial government. Slavery was banned, and in the following years, several laws were passed outlawing even the presence of free blacks.
Fear on the part of the settlers that the blacks would take jobs away from whites, as well as concerns about slave revolts and the idea that we don't even want to have those out here, what the settlers think.
The abundance of natural resources in Oregon and its connection to Pacific trade routes inspired many schemes for its development. But with no significant means of overland or river transport to the east, Oregon would remain relatively isolated until the 1860s. While Oregon developed slowly, it seemed that California grew up almost overnight. With the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in 1848, the gold rush was on. They came on horseback, on foot, and by ship, and those who came by ship usually landed at San Francisco.
By early 1849, mid-1849, thousands of people are coming here. And what was this little small settlement suddenly becomes a major city. In fact, there was a period in 1849 when the population of San Francisco doubled every 10 days.
Hotels, housing, stores, and saloons rose so rapidly that no thought was given to city planning. The makeshift wooden buildings easily caught fire. Fortunes that had been gained in a few months were lost in a few hours. With no effective government, law enforcement was practically non-existent.
You had enormous numbers of beatings and muggings and thievery and killings and so forth. You have, in 1851, so much violence that a number of the merchants and the upper classes band together and form what is called the First Committee of Vigilance.
In the mining camps, men from the United States, Mexico, France, Germany, Great Britain, Spain, Russia, Latin America, and even China mingled together, working their claims by day, telling stories around the campfires by night. In California, gold was the great equalizer.
I met a man today from the mines in patched buckskins, rough as a badger from his hole, who had $15,000 in yellow dust swung at his back. Clear out of the way with your crests and crowns and pedigree trees, and let this Democrat pass.
California's rapid increase in population forced the issue of statehood on it almost immediately, preempting the usual territorial phase of government.
They elected to go in as a free state. So then they have an election for state officials, a legislature, governor, and so forth. They elect 2 senators and a congressman, or 2 congressmen, and they go to Washington and say, here's our Constitution, we want to be a state. Well, this will trigger what is called the Great Compromise of 1850.
The causes which exclude slavery from California lie within a nutshell. All here are diggers, and free white diggers won't dig with slaves. An army of 500,000, backed by the resources of the United States, could not shake their purpose.